So, hello everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you all today at this webinar dedicated to the 5th anniversary of the COP21 with a research perspective. I thank all the panelists for having accepted our invitation, Adam Tours, Éloi Laurent, Harold Winkler, and coming soon, Rogero Studart. I also thank Etienne Espang for having coordinated this event. So this webinar inaugurates a new series of research conversations that will focus on strategic topics for development. Because better understanding means acting more effectively, AFD is conducting extensive applied research. The main objective of this research is to accompany developing countries in their economic, ecological, and social transitions. This research has two markers. First, it is carried out in association with academic partners from the South, but more and more for the South, I mean. And the second, it is undertaken by a multidisciplinary team, specialists in economics, but also in environmental science, sociology, demography, anthropology, or political science. Beyond the production of knowledge, it is essential to share it, to accelerate its dissemination, to debate it, to make it alive and directly useful for development actors. So we, of course, support the publication as a support of dissemination. And I encourage you all to see our website. But we have also big research conference, such as the one we have organized a few weeks ago within the Finance in Commons Summit, the first global summit of all public development banks, which gathered more than 400 of them around the challenges of reconciling short-term countercyclical responses with sustainable recovery measures. But beyond that, so it appeared to us necessary to offer a regular platform for discussion of research works, their results, and their perspective open up to public policy. Entitled Research Conversation, or Conversation de Recherche, this new event is offered in the form of twice-a-month webinars in French or English, depending on the speakers. Global warming, safeguarding biodiversity, and recreating social ties are among the topics that will be addressed in these research conversations. So today, 5 years after the success of the COP21 meeting, where do we stand, especially after the COVID-19 crisis? What are the new challenges ahead for developing and emerging economies and development institutions ahead of the global stocktake in 2023? Is carbon neutrality a game changer in climate diplomacy or for climate finance? What should be the scope of climate justice and just transition when assessing the climate impact of an investment? Can we separate the climate impact from the redistribution question, or should both questions be handled in 1 minute social contract? And what would be the underlying institutional transformation of such a renewed contract? Which social groups would be in a position to lead this transformation? What would be the key steps to reconcile the climate and biodiversity agendas for the incoming year 2021? These are a few questions this webinar will try to address today. With this consideration, so I will now leave the floor to Etienne Espang, who is a senior environmental economist at EFD Research Department. So we will introduce the panelists and moderate the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hélène. Before I present our stellar panel, really, let me give our audience some technical precisions regarding the use of the Livestorm platform. So you see on the right side of your screen, you have different panels for chats, questions, polls, and people. I think you should all focus on the question panel, where you may want to ask questions throughout the presentations and the discussion. You can write them directly there, and the audience can vote in favor of some key questions. The speakers can also answer some of them directly, and I do my best to ask some of those questions on stage to our speakers during the Q&A session. So today we have really four experts that we are glad to welcome in alphabetical order. We have Éloi Laurent. Éloi, you are Senior Research Fellow at OFCE, Sciences Po Center for Economic Research. You're a professor in the School of Management and Innovation at Sciences Po, visiting professor at Stanford University. You've been special aide to the French Prime Minister Lionel Jospin. You're also an author or editor of about 12 books, the latest one published in the last few weeks on the notion of One Health as a response to our current pandemic crisis. So, Laurent, good afternoon. Rogerio Studat, who will be joining us very soon, is currently a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute, a non-resident fellow of Brazil's Center of International Relations, CEBRI, and a distinguished fellow at the Global Federation of Competitiveness Councils. So he was also an executive director to the World Bank Group, representing Brazil and 8 other nations on the executive board committee at the G20 and other international forums. He's been an executive director for Brazil and Suriname at the Inter-American Development Bank Group. An economist by profession, he has extensively published on the transformations of the financial system and different proposals to scale up investments in low carbon directions in the emerging or developing economies. So we will be welcoming Rogerio Studat very soon. Adam Booz, for those who have been interested in the financial turmoils of the latest decade, it's not really necessary to present you. And for the others, let's say you're a professor at Columbia University, director of the European Institute. You have been working a lot on the economic history of Germany, especially during the Nazi period, as a historian. And lately, with the book Crashed, How a Decade of Financial Crisis Changed the World, you've been studying history in the making, in this case, history of the financial collapse that we all experienced in 2008 and what happens after. Lately, we've been reading more and more articles by you about climate policies and its links with the transformations of the geopolitical order and the financial system. And we were particularly interested by your analysis of the dynamics of carbon neutrality announcements by China and its potential for a geopolitical shift. So we are also very glad that you could join us today. And last but not least, Harald Winkler, you're a professor at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, member of the Academy of Science of South Africa, coordinating lead author for the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, on mitigation and development pathways. This is the reason why you will have to leave in just 1 hour, so at 3 p.m. To be able to reach a meeting of the IPCC for the 6th report, which is coming up next year. You were a member of the High-Level Economic Commission on Carbon Prices, co-chaired by Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz and Lord Nicholas Stern. And I'm probably forgetting many other achievements in writing on topics including transparency, equity, and comparative analysis of mitigation actions in developing countries. And you will share for us today some recent thoughts on the notion of just transition with a neo-Gramscian perspective and an application to South Africa. So very nice to have you here as well, Harald. So today is, as we said, an occasion to talk about the current situation of climate policies 5 years after the Paris Agreement. So we may remember that the central and ultimate goal of the Paris Agreement is to hold the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, as stated in Article 2.1 of the agreement. So all of the parties to the Climate Convention agreed on this goal and contribute to it, supported by non-state actors as well. So I guess one key aspects that happened today, that happened lately, is the announcement of carbon neutrality horizons by all major powers. So the year 2020 will be probably remembered as the COVID year, but it should also be remembered as that year where all major powers decided to go carbon neutral with a specific horizon for each of them. So the question I would ask, and we will start by Adam too, is this a real shift in the global order, or are we just facing yet another schism of reality between political statements and real actions?
Thank you. Is the sound okay? Can you?
Very good.
Okay, excellent. So it's a real honor to be on this panel along such distinguished contributors to this to the politics of climate and to the debate about it, and fitting, of course, that we have French hosts on this occasion. I'm also, I should say, and this is where the main thrust of my comments are going to be, fascinated and delighted to be talking to those in the business of credit creation, of financing, in other words, bankers of a sort. And that is, in fact, going to be the main thrust of what I have to say. We will, I hope, wrap around to the geopolitical questions in the Q&A. Because 5 years ago, in 2015, Paris stood for two things. It stood for the climate agreement, whose anniversary we're celebrating, but it also, of course, stood for the Paris School of Economics, Thomas Piketty and the new inequality agenda. 2014 was the year that capital broke and changed the discussion about political economy worldwide. And this was an indispensable addition, I think, to our thinking. And still in Helene's opening remarks, we can hear, I think, the echo of that question. Not, of course, that it's new to the development agenda, but the Piketty intervention really, I think, changed the global argument. And we know how crucial the just transition agenda is for securing legitimacy and political buy-in and momentum. And again, France and the Gilets jaunes demonstrated what happens if you don't take that seriously. But from a macroeconomic point of view, it seems to me that to couple inequality and the question of the energy transition too closely is not so much an opportunity as a trap. A trap which in radical guise, i.e. driven by interest in wealth taxation, tax evasion, steers us towards highly conventional and disabling views of the potential of finance. The trap is to think that the right question to ask is, and the right question to start with, is how do we pay for the energy transition? We need $150 billion for climate adaptation, Piketty and Chancel argued in a paper they submitted to the Paris conference in 2015. And then they give the radical answer, well, we'll pay for it by taxing the rich, by redistribution, etc. Now, I'm all in favor of redistributive taxation and an attack on tax evasion. If that helps to buy political support for high energy prices and expensive modifications to people's homes in the advanced economies, all the better. I'm in favor of building fiscal capacity, both in advanced and emerging market contexts. And I'm in favor of supporting low-income countries with transfers from the advanced economies as a matter of equity and urgency. But from a macroeconomic perspective, or from a macro-financial perspective, the question, how do we pay for X, is poorly posed. It's the fiscal equivalent of the lump of savings fallacy. How do we pay for the energy transition ought not even to be more than a technical question. How can we can pay, this is the great Keynes quote from 1942 in his essay, How Important is Finance? We can pay for anything we can do. Since in making this point, I'm effectively paraphrasing Anne Pettifor's book, The Case for the Green New Deal, you may think that you've invited some sort of latter-day Jeremy Corbyn, AOC, Bernie Sanders advocate of the Green New Deal with MMT in the background. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, actually. They're absolutely right that state budget deficits should not be an obstacle to anything that we need to do, as Stephanie Kelton has eloquently argued in her recent best-selling book. And we're seeing that demonstrated in real time all around us. If anything this year has demonstrated, it is the total irrelevance of fiscal constraints when states set their minds to big purposes. Huge deficits, vast surges in debt, no inflation, no interest rate spikes, even for the big EM. Indonesia, for instance, a crucial arena for climate policy borrowing, is now borrowing at lower rates than ever before. And Brazil, as we know, has blown out its budget's deficit. It has produced, of course, an anxious debate about what the future is, but the capacity for action is clearly there. The problem with my friends in the Green New Deal MMT camp is that they're far too fixated on the state. Their imagination circles around the world wars. It's a bad Anglo-Saxon habit, along with the idea of talking about leadership all the time as though people were expecting them to lead. As for the war analogy, global heating is clearly an existential threat, but it's totally unhelpful to think of it as a sudden surge total war effort type of challenge. What we need is global structural change over a matter of decades. And how does structural change in capitalism normally happen? It's driven by price signals, by credit, and the coagulation of those two together into political economic blocks, which pursue various types of technological agenda, driven by those incentives. And the best analyst of that, we actually can find, you can go back 100 years to somebody like Schumpeter, who emphasizes the flexible, erratic influence of bank credit. Like I'm saying, I'm kind of pleased to be talking to bankers because you are in the business of lending. You can see the impression on me made by an excellent early piece by Rogerio Studart on precisely this question. You need capital, of course, to launch your bank, and you have to fund yourselves. But the first move, the credit creation, is ex nihilo. It confers purchasing power, unleashes competition for real resources. It gives huge power to banks through credit creation. It voids that question of how do we pay for X in the short run. Can our existing credit system, was one of the prompts you asked me, put to me, finance structural change? Of course it can. It does it all the time. The question is in which direction and whether it can be remotely equitable. So the financial system is profit-driven, elastic, dynamic, and intensely hierarchical. These are the things that we know about it. So what can we say very briefly as I wrap up these comments, these brief opening comments, in general, about the credit system in its current moment that might help frame the interventions of my far more expert colleagues on the question of how the energy transition happens in the vast majority of the world? The first point I think to make, and no argument should be brooked on this, is that money is indescribably easy right now. A huge part of sovereign debt is yielding negative interest rates. We therefore have a historic opportunity to borrow precisely at the moment when we must. And there's absolutely no reason to think this is purely a temporary situation. There is every reason and every signal in the market saying this goes forever. It will be a travesty, therefore, to get bogged down in painful conversations about tax when we simply don't need to. And in what is the worst case scenario? Say we spend really big on energy transition and we unleash an inflation in the advanced economies, well, then everyone will cheer and central bankers can go back to doing what central bankers are comfortable doing. 2 to 3% inflation would be a dream and we're miles away from it. The second point to make is that an abundance of funding really does, we now have 10 years of experience of this, spill over into low income, emerging, and what investment bankers call frontier markets. Peru just issued a 100-year bond at 3%. Why? Because of yield chasing and because of fundamentals. Peru has copper, and everyone knows that in a transition scenario, there will be huge global demand for copper. So don't get me wrong, Peru is a country in massive political turmoil right now. All the important questions about just terms of trade, control of environmental damage have to be answered. But markets broadly are sending the right signals that makes finance an extraordinary vehicle for change at this moment, potentially could be steered in that direction. This then comes on to the issue, as it were, of signal setting and carbon neutrality commitments. If we're Keynesians and we believe in the fundamental, as it were, priority of radical uncertainty as the environment in which everyone operates, and COVID has demonstrated that more than ever, then large-scale, more or less credible commitments by big actors to long-term time horizon change like carbon neutrality do make a difference. They help to reorientate investment decision-making, and we are seeing that all around us at this moment. Organizations like the IMF now accept furthermore that there can be crowding in as well as crowding out, elaborately illustrated in their recent report. Those commitments by the EU, by China, by Japan, by South Korea in short succession between September and October this year do, I agree with Etienne, make a difference. They're all pointing in the same direction, and you can see the response in capital markets right now. And yes, we are seeing a fundamental realignment that many of us, I think, would have thought completely impossible 5 years ago at the heart of the financial system in central banking. Look at the announcements of the Danish central bank, the Bank of England, and either, I gather, from private conversations at the Fed right now. So this is the good news. But we should be cautious, and then let me end with a series of caveats. First, this year has shown the extraordinary vulnerability of low-income borrowers when faced with a shock. We're going to see at least six sovereign defaults this year. This year has also shown the complete inadequacy of the global financial safety net precisely for those borrowers when crisis strikes. Thirdly, Biden's won, but America is bona fide now, and take it from me living here, a madhouse. And so anything the United States commits to should be taken as nothing more than a 4-year commitment at this point, and that extends out from bilateral commitments from the United States through to its role in the IMF and the World Bank. Malpass has chosen this year to pick a fight with the Chinese over concessions, even though the Chinese are making the largest concessions of any bilateral creditor in the Paris Club. The EU is less of a madhouse, but it has its own populism problem, as we're seeing in Eastern Europe, and not for nothing. Those are the states with the entrenched communist-era fossil fuel-heavy political cultures that still need to be for which we do not have as yet an energy transition exit. China seems steadier, But it has absolutely everything to prove on the climate front, and everything, of course, depends on the news we get from the 14th five-year plan. And we may not be able, and this for me has been the shock of the last couple of days, is realizing the extent of the pullback of Chinese funding. I don't know whether you've seen Kevin Gallagher's most recent data set on the lending by the two giant Chinese development banks, the Chinese Development Bank and the Export Impact Bank. These are banks which between them lent more than the World Bank in the last 10 years. Their lending has collapsed from 75 billion in 2016 to 4 billion last year. So we may be heading towards a world beyond One Belt, One Road. And that is not, I think, a scenario that many of us envisioned. In such a world, without One Belt, One Road, borrowers end up relying more heavily than ever on private bondholders. And another lesson we have learned from this year is, as nice and enlightened as the people in the IIF may be when we're in the world of finance Twitter, when it comes to their ability to actually deliver concessions from private bondholders, they have no influence whatsoever on that conversation. We don't have a framework. Against all this backdrop, it seems to me that the evident need is for publicly backed development banks of various kinds to take the risk out of the system, which is why, as I say, I'm delighted to be speaking to you as chair also of the IDFC, because they, insofar as I think we have a kind of vision of how we make this system better, your sort of agencies are precisely the way in which you can leverage this. This is not to say that this answers the problem. This is a narrowly finance-focused question. But in that domain, this is the way I think we take the risk out of the system, is by backstopping the potentially gigantic private credit flows by various types of public insurance, by various types of public guarantee, to make use of the enormous dynamic power that lies in the financial system, and which allows us to sidestep or treat as a separate and distinct set of issues the questions of equity, inequality, which also, of course, urgently need addressing. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Adam Tooze, for this brilliant landscape on, let's say, the progress we've made and the caveats in the last 5 years, and especially all the changes that occurred already in 2020 on the geopolitical and financial landscape and their implications for climate policies ahead. I had in mind that Roger Justo might want to jump in here. I guess this would resonate well with what you've just been saying, Adam Tooze. So Roger, first I want to welcome you, welcome on board, and I think that Adam just finished his speech on the role of public development banks, and that's a key point where you want to you have some proposals and a lot of experience, of course, to share with us. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Excellent. First of all, how long do I have?
Well, let's say 10 minutes max.
Excellent. And second, let me apologize to you all for the delay. I had, I had an issue trying to put together the different times from Brazil, France, Shanghai, and around there, I did not quite understand that I had two extremely important overlapping conversations, and of course one is this one that I'm having now. And I want to thank you very much for the invitation, and apologize to the previous speakers that I was not present, and I look forward to the conversation with them. But for the introduction of TDN, I hope that I'll be able to add some thoughts to the conversation thus far. Let me explain to you a little bit about the previous meeting, which I think is going to be interesting for you to know. I'm a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute, but also a senior fellow at the Center of Foreign Relations in Brazil. And they had a meeting with the New Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Bank, the leaderships of them, and the World Bank to discuss the future of multilateralism. So, and I was part of the conversation, and I'm glad that preceded this conversation, because it brought a lot of issues that I want to bring to you. Let me also say to you that I have a personal and professional relationship to the theme. Not only I worked for a long time at the World Bank as an economist and the United Nations as an economist, but also I had the honor and the privilege to join the World Bank as an executive director for 8 countries in 2008, just in the year preceding the 2009 crisis. I'm a macroeconomist and a finance person by training. And so to see that happening and the discussions that happened there, the creations of, for instance, groupings such as the BRICS Bank, but also the emergence of new institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the New Development Bank was for me an extraordinary moment, but also an extraordinary lessons from what multilateralism should be, the issues that multilateralism had been addressing. At that time, if you remember, we all remember, we're all there in different positions. I mean, we had a crisis that was the largest crisis of the new globalized world. And we still had some issues that the global community were not addressing properly, such as inequality and poverty, which remains a major issue. But then in front of us, we had a crisis that was unprecedented except for the beginning of last century. And the impacts were extraordinary in terms of initially in trade, then growth and employment, name it. It was a trickle down coming from the United States, which was extremely negative. And I was in the middle of discussions on how one of the Bretton Woods institutions should respond, and I was also involved in the discussions at the IMF, should respond to this unprecedented crisis. I had to say that that multilateralism at that moment was really losing traction. It was very clear that the emergence of different players were putting the multilateralism, particularly the governance of multilateralism, in challenge. And then I saw very quickly the creation of the G20 and the more structured collective response, which was extraordinary in a way in the beginning, because it showed the capacity of multilateral cooperation in addressing global challenges. It was at the same time, it made me very optimistic, but very short period of time. And the two challenges that we observed from within we still remain issues, or the issues of governance and how you address a collective crisis where at the same time members and they're necessary to give the collective response felt that they were not fully represented in that. So the discussions at the World Bank and IMF were extremely tense but also very rich. And the second issue was that very quickly countries, particularly those with hard currency, understood that they could go through the national responses that took form of the quantitative easing situations, which left a lot of other members that were part of that coalition behind, and some of them from Brazil, facing the consequences of being left behind. At the same time, I think that it became very clear then that the other global crisis, in addition to inequality and poverty and instability, was related to climate change. It's interesting that it was emerging as an issue in the multilateral world. However, the issue was already there, and I personally got very concerned about the issue, of course, and you all understand that. And I decided that from then on, I had to reinvent myself. In addition to being a development economist, I had to reinvent myself to understand the challenges of climate change and how we could, as a global community, address the issue. And that's how I ended up many years at the World Resources Institute, which is a climate change institution. Being a macroeconomist, think tank, being a macroeconomist and financial expert, little contribution that I had to give at that point was writing about financing the transition to a low carbon economy. And this is, I think, why Etienne very kindly invited me for this, because I wrote a paper talking about the financing of the transition of the low carbon, what kind of institutional arrangements you needed to promote a transition to a low carbon economy in different countries with different, and I was particularly concerned with developing countries, because the transition to low carbon economy will require a significant mobilization of resources. And we still leave the problem of how to mobilize resources in developing countries. And this has increased. I saw Adam saying, touching on the issue, particularly important in developing countries for two reasons, because they do not issue hard currencies, or three issues, I'd say. They don't have very deep financial markets in general. They're not evolved. They're often bank-based. And the third one is that they have put themselves into macroeconomic settings, into monetary and fiscal policy settings that constrain the capacity of states to respond to crises like this. And this situation has become even more significant now. At that time, I was very optimistic when I wrote the paper that let Etienne invite me here, and we published together. I was very optimistic about the trends in the green finance market. I was looking around and say, okay, there's an increase of supply of loanable transformation in the world. How do you create an architecture that that can channel those funds into developing countries? So we need to address several issues, but particularly the cooperation between policy instruments. One of each, I think, is really important. It has to do with the previous conversation with development banks. At a national level, which are basically the ones where most of the mobilization has to take place, a regional level, and a multilateral level. That would require an architecture that was very different from we had then. Since then, I just have 2 minutes, I would say, to conclude, and then we can talk to that. I became less optimistic about the multilateral system until now. I think we have an opportunity now, because with the pandemic, of a resurgence in terms of multilateral cooperation. We have a chance. I'm a skeptical optimist. We have a chance. And we have to quickly think what kind of cooperation we have to have within the instruments of the multilateral system in order to enhance, in order to mobilize the resources needed not only to face this crisis, but also to face other crises coming forth, which is climate change. So we have, I'm a little bit worried, but I think that it is important that we have a chance now. The second thing is that green finance has increased in a significant way. And this is not being just done through regulations and mandates. This is important. It has become part of an economic rationale, and this is what the finance person comes into, because the climate risk has been incorporated in the risk management of large institutional investors, which means that they are diversifying now. They need to diversify. Think about, insurance companies in California. Okay, they are so exposed to the impacts of extreme climate events, that they will have to diversify by economic logic into assets that are backed by sustainable projects. That creates a major change in portfolio diversification, an increase of loanable funds to this. But thus far, and we can talk more about this, I will conclude now, thus far this has been very concentrated in Europe, in the United States, and some Asian countries, because those countries have two things. That those regions have, or countries, let's say groups of countries, have two different aspects that are important. First, an incredible capacity to generate pipelines of projects that can be used to back issuance of credit of securities that are of sustainable projects. The second thing is that they have deeper financial systems, which allow for the state to have a much rapid rolling greening the systems much faster than you have in other countries. I will stop here. I say with just two comments. First, we have an opportunity now to create an institution, a new institutional framework that could allow to mobilize resources to address all this challenge. We have the technology too, and what we need is cooperation. The second thing, we have to very quickly, as researchers, as policy making thinkers, let's put it this way, to think about this new institutions, frameworks that would allow to mobilize resources, but also to channel that to countries that are deeply in need of resources to make the transitions for a new green economy and green and sustainable economy. I'll stop here. And once again, I apologize for jumping a little bit late, and I hope to join you with the conversation now. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rogerio. I noticed the question of the hard currency, how to have access to hard currency for developing and emerging economies, and the macroeconomic settings, which have generally worsened this year, particularly, and that may impede any green-oriented reconstruction in the next few months and years. And I think that will be a topic for discussion after with probably. In your introduction, you talked about the link between poverty, inequality, and climate change, and I think that will be the key second topic of this roundtable as we will introduce this question of just transition. So Adam just said that maybe it's not a good idea to link closely this issue of fighting against inequality and fighting against climate change. So we see what Éloi Laurent and Harald Winkler may say about that. So Éloi Laurent, the floor is yours now. You have a presentation, so that's
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Etienne, for the invitation. Thank you, AFD. I'm very happy and honored to be here to talk to you. So I will try to contradict Adam so that we are having fun in this panel. So I think that they are actually deeply intertwined, linked, those issues of climate transition and inequality. So I will start with the state maybe of well, at least as how I see things 5 years after the Paris Agreement. I think that things are frozen. So you have two layers of ice. The first layer of ice was Trump, and then you have the second layer of ice, which is COVID. And then when we unfreeze this, very much in the Pfizer mode, I think what we will find is that climate negotiations are still frozen. That basically we have a problem, which is that we have not made a lot of progress in the last 5 years. And my argument is actually that we have not made progress because we have not really started the conversation on climate justice. And as long as we do not start this conversation at the global and national level, it's going to be difficult to make progress. So I will briefly, well, let me start right away. So this is, of course, Greta Thunberg in the New York harbor when she came to the US. And what you see on her sails is her motto, which is "Unite behind the science." In a way, of course, this is very much important because we need to know the science. But I think that humans have never, in the history of mankind, united behind science to do anything. And I think that we should not actually unite. Well, it's not by uniting behind the science that we are going to make progress. Is by uniting behind justice. I think that the motto should be "Unite behind justice," and this is what really drives human action much more than science. So science is a first step, but then we need to translate climate science into climate justice, so to have actually action and meaningful action. And so this is where the idea of just transition and just climate transition comes in. So of course, this is a joke, building the transition in 3 easy steps. It's not, none of them are easy, and taken together, they are just, unsurmountable. But still, I think that we can at least say what they look like. So the first idea of the just transition was, in the labor, with the labor trade unionist Tony Mazzocchi, 1993, it was the idea that we should compensate basically the workers in the fossil fuel industries, because climate change is going to mean that we need to exit from fossil fuels, and they should not pay for it because they are not responsible for it. They're not responsible for climate change or for climate transition, and so we should, compensate the fact that they are going to lose their jobs and their pensions, etc. And this was really, taken upon in the Katowice Declaration, which is that the just transition is for the workforce in the fossil fuel industries. And this is what you also see in the EU Green Deal with the just transition mechanism, which is that just transition is really about that. I think that the challenge of the just transition is much greater than just, this problem of compensation of fossil fuel industries. So there is, contrary once again to what Adam said, I'm just joking, there is a justice sustainability nexus, which is extremely powerful and more tangible, I think, with each year that passes. And so there are 3 steps, okay? So the first step, the first question of this just climate transition is, what is the world that we don't want anymore? And I think that this is a world where we see that inequality and unsustainability go hand in hand. That inequality is a pollution, and that pollution is an inequality. All right. So we want to move beyond this world. This is why we want the transition. I'm not going to address that, but it's of course an important question. Then the second question of the transition is, what is the just world that we desire and what we should be aiming for? And this is where the idea of beyond growth, is so important, because we need to have new ends, for the economic game that we are playing. I think the economic growth is not the right finality for our action. And the third question is, how do we build policies that are just themselves between the world that we don't desire anymore toward the world that we desire? And so this is the question of how do we build those just policies, those social-ecological policies. And this is mostly what I'm going to talk about in the framework of climate negotiations. So we need to build those just policies at the global level and then at the national level. So is there hope that we can do it at the global level? I think that there might be, because I think that there is an historical convergence of climate responsibilities between the 3 main players of climate negotiations. I think that you see a convergence between China and the EU when it comes to emissions per capita, and it's the first time. Actually, China is now above the EU. And you also see a convergence between the US and China when it comes to historical responsibility, at least when you consider 1990 as the reference date for historical responsibility. And I think that this is the right date because responsibility entails intention. And I think that 1990 is the point where you cannot say anymore that you don't know. And so because of this convergence, I think that there is ground for having a serious conversation about climate justice. And climate justice is really, how do we allocate the remaining carbon budget until 2050? There is no other question for me for COP26. I don't see any other question than this one. How do we allocate? On what basis do we allocate the remaining carbon budget? And if we are talking about allocation, then we are talking about criteria of allocation. And it comes back to the question of equity. What are the equity criteria to allocate the remaining carbon budget until 2050? If we can solve this, we will make progress in COP26. If we don't, I don't see that we can make progress, significant progress, okay? So do we have a sense of the kind of criteria that we could use? I think that there are plenty, okay? This is a simple version of it. You take, consumption emission rather than production emissions, you take per capita emissions, you take historical responsibility from 1990, then you consider the level of development that is reached, and then maybe you could add, demographic projections, and you end up with equity criteria. This is very simple. This is completely debatable, but at least it's an attempt to count emissions, not in the way that they are being counted at the UNFCCC, which is still, global emissions per country. I think it doesn't make sense actually to have this kind of criteria, because we know that the picture is changing when you are changing, the way you account for emissions, and so we need to have an open debate about equity criteria for allocating this budget. And then once every country has this budget, the question is, how do you allocate emissions within each country? And that there you have a second conversation on climate justice, which is within each country, how do you allocate those things? You have seen, like me, the UNEP report that was out today. If you look at chapter 6 of the UNEP report, you will see that they are trying to address this question. They are trying to, address this equity question, and they call it equitable lifestyle changes. All right, and so I think that so how do you do this? For example, in a country like France, where you have had the Gilets jaunes, revolting against the unfairness of carbon taxation. With a colleague from CIRED, Audrey Berry, we using her micro simulation models, we wrote a very simple paper on how can you reform actually carbon taxation in France so that it benefits a majority of the French people. And you actually don't see the kind of revolt that we have seen against unfair carbon taxation. And you can have that, it exists already. And so you can have simple criteria, for example, the question of where do you live and how much do you earn? And then, have mitigation tools that are socially fair. So it's possible to have this conversation. That's really my point, all right? And I think that unless we are really having this two-step conversation on climate justice, is going to be very difficult to make progress on climate negotiation. On the contrary, I think that climate justice is the solution to climate change, basically. So I want to end with the question of what should we aim for? Okay, what should be the final goal? If we agree that the world in which we are living in is not desirable, if we are able to build, just policies to another world, then what should it be? Should it be just a world where we increase economic growth? And my idea, but I don't want to take too much time, is that we should not aim for GDP or economic growth, and that's a huge problem actually for current economic policies, and especially recovery policies, so-called recovery policies. An economic system that's able to produce this kind of disaster, such as the COVID-19, shouldn't recover. Okay, it should die. And we should, the question is not recovery, the question is really reinvention. And the question with what are we aiming for? And so my idea, but there are many others, is that health is actually the right indicator rather than GDP, but also rather than, the full employment in the style of the second Beveridge report. I think that full health is actually the right indicator because it is the great mediator between social systems and natural systems. And so you see in this very simple social-ecological feedback loop that I've designed that you have two critical nodes. The first node is between inequality and sustainability, and the second node is between human health and ecosystems health. And then you are trying to make the current vicious spiral turn into a virtuous feedback loop. It's not simple, but as I said, it was a joke, all right? 3 easy steps to building the just transition. This is not easy, but well, at least it's some ideas and some interesting contradiction in the panel. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Éloi, for this first presentation on just transition or the world as it should be. And as I said on your book, Beyond Growth, that the political economy question of your suggestions is very important. And how do we get there, and which groups can be mobilized to realize such an outcome, produce such an outcome? So it's perfect that Harald is talking after you, because his approach to just transition is just really about that, understanding the groups that could be mobilized for that outcome. So Harald, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to AfD, Helene, Etienne, for the invitation. And it's been really fascinating to listen to Adam and Rogerio and Eloi. And I am grateful that I'm coming after you, Eloi, because it follows on fairly directly. So I'm going to try and share my screen. Can you see that?
No, not
visible,
yet.
Etienne? Not yet. Okay, sorry. Even though we practiced yesterday. Share media, not share screen. Share media. Sorry. No. That's. It says here something. Okay. Share media. It wants me to play a video.
Yeah, let me try.
Do you have it, perhaps? Could you share it for me? Because that's why I email it to you. Reliable old technology. Apologies to the participants.
You may start, and I will upload this now.
Okay, so I'm a professor at the University of Cape Town, and I have been thinking about the just transition. And somewhat to my own surprise, I found myself theorizing and going back to neo-Gramscian theory, which I think has some powerful explanations to offer. But before I get into that, I wanted to just think about what is the mindset or worldview that got us to the problem that we have at the moment, which is really a world characterized by high poverty and inequality, especially in the country my country, South Africa, that are our biggest challenges, and climate impacts and high carbon development pathways brought us there. But it's also been an ideology, and I'm using that term in the Gramscian sense, that has been built around growth. And thanks, if you could go to the second slide, Etienne, is what I'm talking to. And it's really the current cultural hegemony is there's only one economic model, which is common sense. And actually that quote of unfettered capitalism is not me, that is Papa Francesco, talking about the multiple contradictions that we face. And I don't want to go into all of those, but just to say 5 years after Paris, I think the key discussion, as Eloi said, is about just transitions. It is about net zero, but of how do we get to net zero? And I think what really matters in that regard is our actors. And so I will very briefly introduce a little bit of the theory that I'm thinking about. So essentially, the theory is built around understanding the relationship between three elements. That's the explanatory model. So on the left-hand side, ideology. This is not in the sense of ideology as dogma, as chanting, "Make America Great Again" or whatever other mantra you care to adhere to. It is in the sense of an actual practice of doing work that can actually be promoted by change agents, the second element on the right. And there's a list there that I won't go into, although I think it's very interesting to think about who exactly are the change agents. And I will say a little bit more about that in the following slides. And really, change agents mobilizing around an ideological element in neo-Gramscian terms, that ideological element being the just transition. So not uniting behind science, but uniting behind a just transition can actually transform fundamental conditions. But in the Gramsci would have called material conditions, but partly why I changed that wording is because I don't think all the conditions are material. Quite a lot of them are informational or non-material and very important in ways that I think are important. But that essentially is the idea that an alliance of change agents coalesces around the just transition. It also very importantly gains support of other actors who perhaps don't have a natural inclination to support the just transition. Otherwise, you don't establish a new hegemony, and then you can actually transform fundamental conditions. If you can go to the next slide. So who might these actors be? Of course, I have no idea, to be clear. So take everything on here just as something to discuss around. But if we have a just transition, and just to explain my little acronym there, zero poverty and zero carbon, not just zero carbon, but also zero poverty, SDG goal 1, right? As well as the goals of the Paris Agreement. You might have states, you might have regions, but the way I've arranged this here, just to pick not an entirely arbitrary example, perhaps further revealing my own interests. Sorry, I think we've gone back. If you can go back here. The social movements, for example, Greta Thunberg was mentioned, clearly are changing and have the power to change the parameters of a debate. We've experienced this in South Africa, and there are certainly others. Cities are another, and there are clearly other actors. Where does organized labor sit, for example? Well, the Gilets jaunes have come up a couple of times, of course. Of course, they might oppose, but it might be important, might be very important, that labor supports the just transition. Of course, the concept itself comes out of the labor movement in the first instance. So next slide, please. And this is just a really heuristic diagram to say that we need the challenge that we actually face is to shift our development pathway. So in the IPCC context, and I apologize that I will have to leave for an IPCC meeting, we are thinking a lot about accelerating mitigation, but saying we've been trying that for the last 20 years and it's not working, or more. And it's not working fast enough. We need to take a broader lens and actually think about how do we make these big, not just an energy transition, but shift our development pathways to increased sustainability, from high poverty to zero poverty, from high inequality to reducing that, from very high impacts, not to forget about the impacts of climate change, to at least moderating the impact. Some impacts are unavoidable, and from high emissions to zero carbon, net zero emissions, and those pathways, just to imagine those. And the next slide, please. I want to become a little bit more concrete of what this might mean in my country, South Africa, and there's always too much to say in a few short meetings, but the challenges of a just transition in South Africa are very complex. There's not just a simple financial question. It is a financial question massively. But there are many actors. Our national utility, vertically integrated Eskom, has operational, structural, and financial issues. An outdated system, structurally dependent on coal, and yet is facing these major challenges of climate change, of moving from more than 90% coal to net zero, but also at the same time the development imperatives. The triple challenge in South Africa is unemployment, poverty, and inequality. If you're not speaking to those, you're not within hearing distance of the policy debate. And so we need to know who are the change agents. Is it going to be Eskom, who is suddenly different? And Eskom has now established a just transition office. Is it the workers? And I already alluded to, it's not, that's one category. Different unions in South Africa act in different ways. Is it communities? Is it different ministries in government? I think I don't have any easy answers, but I do suggest that it is a coalition of agents, of change agents that can actually shift development pathways. The next slide, please. And then, in order to speak to finance a little bit, and I am no expert on finance, let me be very clear about that. There is an idea that has been more than an idea, a transaction that is being developed in South Africa, a group there, Meridian Economics, not my own idea, of a just transition transaction that would fund, and I'm simplifying a complex idea, in fact, there's a word missing there in point one, accelerated decarbonization. Well, I put it in front of the phase out of coal. Sorry, it's correct. Decarbonization through the accelerated phase out of coal. So there is some, in our electricity plan, there is some decommissioning of coal, but at the end of the life. That's not enough for climate change, and that would be accelerated. And to accelerate, to fund social justice via just transition funds. So I briefly just want to point to the two flows of this. So just one of the problems that is facing Eskom, the financial part of that problem. Right now, Eskom does not have access to capital markets. It's junk rated, as is our country. And significantly, our country is junk rated because of Eskom. It's the largest part of the public debt. So a blended finance vehicle would be created. It would blend finance between concessional international finance from development finance institutions, international climate finance, and actually quite significant amounts of commercial funding from our big four banks. And that would be on lent to Eskom. And that's important because that would give Eskom access to capital markets, again, without which It simply cannot continue, and things would not continue. But the proposition is also that the concessional portion of the loan and that value would accumulate in the blended finance vehicle and would be put into a dedicated fund. And we have a particular region of South Africa, Mpumalanga, which is the geographic focus for now of many just transition ideas and initiatives, more than ideas. You need regional economic development so that the workers, not just in the coal-fired power plants and the coal mines and the coal-to-liquids plant, have new livelihoods, and that transition, funding that, and predictable and significant sources of funding are an important element of that idea. And then next, and I think my final slide, is just to say thank you very much. Those were the ideas that I wanted to share, and very sorry that I will have to leave the call and won't be able to participate in but thank you for being able to be part of this.
Thanks a lot, Harald, I mean, you set a very nice framework on which we may discuss further without you, sadly, but I hope we can prolong the talk afterwards in a different context. So I wish you all the best for your IPCC meeting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So maybe going back to more financial-oriented questions 5 years after the Paris Agreement and after this crazy pandemic year, I would ask to Adam Tooze if he considers, it seemed like that, if he considered financial actors as agents of change in the neo-Gramscian sense that Harald Winkler suggested. So do you see them as agents of change? In which respect?
If I might, can I just very briefly clear up what is not really a difference, but I think maybe a misunderstanding? Or I mean, I think Eloi was playing the audience. So, I mean, obviously, I'm not saying. In fact, I explicitly said that the just transition argument is essential, but it's essentially a political argument, in exactly the way that Eloi made it. It's an argument about political sociology. In other words, how do you mobilize certain groups, and what sort of appeals will mobilize certain groups? And both Harald and Eloi made it eloquent, and in the South African case, completely unanswerable case, that inequality, poverty, and unemployment is clearly in the South African case, which is a country with advanced economy CO2 per capita emissions and dire, the worst unemployment rate in the world. Evidently, the things are coupled there politically. And as Eloi also eloquently, and I took to my mind completely convincingly said, from a normative point of view, if we imagine ourselves sitting down at COP26 and having the conversation that needs to be had, it needs to be had along exactly the lines that he suggests. And I also agree with the trickle down. In other words, we need to break this down by national area, and then each one needs to have their own conversation. If you're the United States, you need to start talking about your negative emissions immediately. And then the question will arise, how do we pay for this? Then after those other stages, and at that point, the argument that I'm making enters, which is that's an irrelevant question, because all too often that how do we pay for this then spirals back into the political domain and becomes the obstacle to movement. And the force of the point that I'm trying to make is that it should simply never be admitted. Right? The only question that we should be asking is, can we do this? And are we willing to make the real redistribution of real resources that are actually entailed in making this shift? Not, as it were, we shouldn't allow the how do we pay for this question to decide this issue. And banks have a pivotal role in this, because in the day-to-day, to go back to your question of are they change agents, in the most radically and fundamental sense, and Rogero, I referred earlier to a piece that you did maybe 15 years ago on sort of Schumpeterian thinking about finance. This question of whether banks are change agents is sort of, well, of course they are. Any kind of credit creation is a change agent because it involves an ex nihilo first move. And then, as it were, you see how the chips fall and the question of funding is resolved in retrospect. So, of course, they're change agents. The question is whether they're aligned with the kind of change that we want to see and what kind of coalition is possible with them. And there is a moment right now, I think, where on certain areas, And that kind of the fascinating proposal for ESCOM is a great illustration of this. There are two, there are areas where it's just a no-brainer. It shouldn't really be an issue that, as it were, driving renewable electricity generation is the first move around the world for capital, because it's simply cheaper. But then there are other areas where we may need to use the techniques of financial engineering, which is what that diagram showed, where we slice and dice the risk on the ESCOM portfolio, and certain parts of it become marketable depending on the risk profile. And we use the techniques of financial engineering, which were used to generate the 2007-8 crisis that Ruggiero spoke about so eloquently, more constructively, to actually manage these and allocate the risk. And it isn't a question of public-private. It isn't a question simply of the public sector absorbing all the risk, because there are private sector actors that actually like risky slices of these portfolios. There has to be, however, clarity about the fact there's no backstop for them. So in other words, if you take that high-yielding, high-risk slice of the ESCOM portfolio, no one's going to bail you out if you do, in fact, end up realizing huge losses. So, and this is a question also in the debt renegotiations right now, right? Because it's not at all obvious that the African borrowers, in fact, want the private lenders to be bailed in, because it jeopardizes their private credit ratings. And there's a big argument going on about that as we speak right now. But yes, to answer your general question, Etienne, clearly the financial system is, in capitalism, in a sense, the change agent. That's one of its essential functions.
Yeah, let me jump on a question that was asked on the panel in the right side. So by Dominique Plion, a professor at Paris 13. Said you stressed the idea that we should take advantage of low rates to face the ecological and pandemic crisis. So there's no financing question, as you said. But there is a difference between state, central, and public banks of rich countries and what happens in low-income borrowers and countries, which would be in trouble when rates go up. And that joined a question by Rogério. So in this sense, there is a financing issue and financing question. You should take that north-south, let's say, picture. So maybe Rogério and Adam, you want to jump on that question.
Well, first of all, I'm sorry. I should have thanked Elaine for the invitation earlier with Etienne. Wonderful to see you, Elaine, there. Adam, thank you so much for those remarks. And also, I mean, it makes me feel old, but also honored that you remember a paper that I wrote 15 years ago. And what is interesting is that I haven't changed my mind about that, about the role of finance. But I moved a little bit on thinking about finance and its institutional architecture, and looking at the players of that institutional architecture. So, but before I do that, let me talk a little bit about the political economy of just transition, just to make this conversation a bit spicier. In the WI, we have an initiative called New Climate Economy, and what we do is try to use evidence to show, in macroeconometric modeling, to show the benefits and opportunities of a country engaging in policies that will lead to low carbon economy. And low carbon and inclusive economies. Okay, and overall, the results that we get from the modeling are astounding. I mean, we just made a report on Brazil showing that Brazil could, for instance, increase GDP by 2030 by $500 billion. And create $2 million additional jobs and increase productivity. It will, of course, lower emission, which with other recursive effects on well-being and so on. After that, we have to say, okay, but how you get there? How do you get there? And that's where the political economy of the transition comes. I mean, and that's what my experience working at the World Bank and dealing directly with people that bring us projects comes about. Because the first question that a president, a mayor, or a governor is going to say to you is like, okay, this is wonderful, but how do we get there? How do we finance that? Okay, that's the first question that you have. And that creates the political economy of transition. And we're dealing with that now. For instance, I'm not going to mention countries, but you can imagine those countries. And we engage in countries where we are investing in refinery when they have a decline of oil reserves, and when we know that the carbon prices on producing that commodity is going to decline and become negative in the future. They're going to end up with stranded assets. It's a bad strategy. And if you look at that bad strategy with the numbers that we have for engaging in low carbon transition, you say, why don't you do that? And I heard from an official something that would be interesting for you, is that sometimes it's better to have a bad strategy than have no strategy at all, which for me was astonishing, but makes sense. In the political cycle of that person that talked to me, he is going to be out of government in the question of 4 years. But they have to respond to a crisis that creates much lower jobs. That they have a job crisis in front of them. They have a production jobs in front of them. They have an investment crisis in front of them. So this person knows more or less the stakeholders of the architecture needed to, for instance, push the investments in the refinery. So better do that than do nothing, which is illogical from the point of view of us, but it makes completely logical with that. For that, and when it comes to, for instance, of counter that, you have to say, but you have an opportunity here to mobilize the resources in good quality in order to promote that transition, and also to help you create alternatives in terms of technologies that you use and so on and so on. To do that, you have to have an institutional framework that we call financial sector that it can mobilize the resources. And this is the challenge, because the money, I mean, a lot of people say the money is out there, and as if the money will be translated into the financing of projects automatically. It never happened. And let me give you a recent example. I could talk about the case of much more than me, France, the United States, of Germany, creating the institutional framework that allows for that mobilization. But let's talk about China. Okay, it's an example. At the same time, it's not an example because it's so different, because it's not a democratic market economy. But that's a longer discussion. But in very short period of time, they, through regulation, but also through incentives, they green the financial sectors. They create policy instruments, both realigning China Development Bank, but also creating the New Development Bank and Asian Infrastructure Banks. They created a green market, the green fund markets, in a short period of time. And at the same time, they did this industrial policy to create the technologies required to present themselves as the champion of transition, and with the financing of that. Okay, if we could somehow, collectively in the market economies, mimic that kind of process, then we could go through this political economy of transition and come to this mayor that I talked to, and say, no, you can have much more access to finance, better quality finance to do the transition. And this is where, I mean, it would be extraordinary if a COP, rather than just being a statement of ambitions, if we could think about the transition as a business proposition to some countries, we would avoid to have some countries locking in, because the discourse that some populists are bringing to those countries, that there is no solution. So we're going to stick on, and I can say that about my own country, where a government won an election by having a platform of saying, oh, they've been talking, now we're going to act. And act means in a very destructive policy towards the environment, towards the future. So I hope I made I did not make it even more confusing, but I enriched the conversation here.
Thanks, Rogerio. I'd like to jump on your argument about China, because if I remember well, Eloi, Laurent had chapter or two on this particular and systemic country, saying that maybe we have an example of a country which is going beyond growth, as he was saying. So maybe Eloi, you want to react to maybe to the political, economy, and financial conditions, so that a country can actually go beyond growth by really greening its infrastructure and economy, and want to reflect on that.
Yeah, sure. I want to first say to Adam, yes, I was of course joking. I know that you know how important inequality is, and but your point is I think not only right, but I think we should go even further than the quotation by Keynes, saying that we can pay for everything that we do. We also must pay for everything that we do. And so the question is not just that, how do we pay for this? But also the big question that economists always ask all the time is how much is it going to cost, right? So how much is it going to cost to do the transition? And my question is, how much does it cost to not do the transition? Right, because it's not just that we can pay for everything that we do, we must pay for everything that we do. And we are paying for things that we are doing in 2020. If you want to have an idea of the cost of non-transition, compared to the cost of transition, look at 2020, right? Probably the whole European economy has been destroyed in terms of, the GDP value, okay? $15,000 billion, something like that, has been destroyed, probably much more than that. It's the whole European economy, the whole economy of the EU, all right? So this is the cost of non-transition. So the question when people ask, I think the real point was really made by Nick Stern, in 2007. The cost of inaction is just so far greater than the cost of action. And we see that with climate, we see that with ecosystems and biodiversity destruction. So every time that someone asks about the cost of transition, we should ask back, what is the cost of non-transition? And then I think that the economic debate will be clearer. Now, to go back to China, and of course, the cost of non-transition is going to increase exponentially with each year that passes that we don't do the transition, of course. So this is the worst economic, trade-off ever, to think that we can delay further the transition to sustainability. So just to go back to China, yes, I make the point that China is actually moving beyond growth in the last 10 years. I think that it was the prime minister who said that, China's development is just unsustainable and unbalanced, and it cannot continue. And I think that the Chinese officials have been very clear about that. A country where you have 1.2 million people dying from air pollution each year, 1.2 million people, right? That's the whole number of people dying from COVID so far. So of course it's not sustainable. But the thing is with China, what's interesting, it's the greatest experience in economic growth in the history of mankind. Okay, 1978, 2018, you have 10% real GDP growth per year. You have a GDP that's multiplied by a factor 80, right? And I think that the peak of the Chinese growth cycle is the COVID-19 pandemic, right? I think that this hyper growth, okay, that supposedly resulted in hundreds of millions of people getting out of poverty, of course, but they are going to go back into poverty in the next 10 to 15 years if, all ecosystems are destroyed and biodiversity is destroyed. And we will go back to poverty in 30 years, right, if we continue on this path. So I think that China must go beyond growth in its own interest and for the interest of the planet, basically. Okay, it's an experience in hyper growth that shows how unsustainable, the economic model has become. And I want to really make this point very clear. This 2009 was the last economic crisis of the 20th century. It was a traditional economic crisis, a crisis because of financial unsustainability. With this crisis, we are entering the 21st century. The crises of instability are going to be about ecological instability, right? And this is much more serious. When I hear, people, including very, respected and, insightful people like Esther Duflo say that this is an external crisis, with respect to the economic system. That's not a crisis that's been generated by the economic system. This is, a health crisis that's affecting the economic system. It's exactly the opposite. It's an internal, very deep crisis from the economic system as it functions that is affecting health, and because it is destroying the environment, right? So if 2009 was a great recession, this is a deep recession, okay? And so I think as long as we don't understand that we must change these economic systems in the 21st century, or we are going to just have those economic systems being destroyed. It's just we have economic systems that are unsustainable because they are destroying themselves. Okay, it's as simple as that. So the first priority is you take care of ecosystem. This allows human health to actually thrive and flourish, and then you can have social cooperation, which economic activity is only a facet of. If you try to go the other way around, grow your economy and then destroy the environment, which will destroy your health, what you end up having is just a self-destruction. So the idea that you have a trade-off between health and the economy, this is absurd. And it's absurd because you don't have a trade-off between the economy and the environment. This is the main reason why it is absurd, right? So yes, China is going beyond growth because I think they have no choice.
Thanks, Eloi. Maybe Adam, you want to react, and then I will let Hélène ask a last question to the panelists and conclude this very, very nice, very interesting session.
Eloi is a real pleasure. He's a very compelling speaker. I mean, I think it's worth differentiating. I mean, broadly speaking, I agree with you, of course, that we should regard the COVID epidemic as endogenous. It's not exogenous, right? It's endogenous to our unbalanced lifestyle and our balanced relationship with nature. But I think what we should also recognize surely is the difference between that problem and the climate, global warming as a challenge, right? And the two differences that really strike is the timeline. So if we're honest with ourselves and we were focused on climate at the beginning of this year, we were blindsided by the pace at which this crisis moved. This isn't, of course, to say that in other silos of the modern surveillance state, there weren't very professional people warning of disease X, but they were not integrated into the political economy conversation the way that climate was. So we were preparing for an attritional trench warfare, 15, 20, 25-year struggle with the climate problem, and we were hit by a blitzkrieg. We were hit by something that was moving at the pace of days and weeks, and our incapacity to manage that problem led to the problems that we've had. The other huge difference in terms of political economy is that with regard to climate, the striking thing is that we've been willing to do nothing for such a long time, very little anyway, concretely. We've thematized the problem, but we live with massive cognitive dissonance. The extraordinary thing about COVID from a political economy point of view is we actually did react to it at huge cost, as Eloi is pointing out. Now, you will say, Eloi, there's no trade-off, and I understand what you mean by that. But of course, there are, in fact, micro trade-offs within this, and there are various choices that could have been made. And the choices that were made in the West were hugely suboptimal relative to the ones that were made in East Asia. But nevertheless, the really remarkable thing is that we, in fact, shut down and then locked down and are doing it again. So we made reactions that I think the political economy of climate did not prepare us for. Not only was the time horizon wrong, but also our understanding of, as it were, what we were able to do collectively was somewhat off kilter. Not in the end, it turns out, our assessment of, as it were, the relative capacity of the Chinese to manage this kind of problem, and this is going back to one of Ruggiero's points, and our own. In other words, they did it much more effectively on the whole. But nevertheless, what we did in Europe and the United States, I think for most people has come as a huge surprise. And that has caused me to rethink, as it were, and I can't say that I'm really at the end of the process, what I think is possible with regard to the climate issue. But part of my possibilism, if you like, my emphasis on the fact that certain problems should really now just be taken off the agenda, comes from that sense of, don't anyone ever pose this question of how we pay for this. Again, it's an absurd, obscene question. We know that in a crisis like this, we can take the huge slices of the workforce out of production and pay for them. And it's clearly the right thing to do. And there is, in fact, fairly widespread political support for it. So I think that's what I would emphasize. I don't disagree with your general diagnosis, but I think it's as interesting to think about the differences within the recognition that this is I would say it's the first crisis of the Anthropocene, if you're willing to accept the word Anthropocene, or the first crisis of the Capitalocene, if you prefer that phrase. But I agree with you about the qualitative shift, but it's slightly different from the one that we anticipated at the beginning of this year. And I think we need to chew long and hard on that. And I think for climate, there are some pretty grim implications, because you could, after all, simply ask yourself why, for 30 years, we have predictions which are every bit as bad as the crisis that we're actually facing with regard to the corona this year, because after all, it's by no means the worst kind of pandemic we could have faced. And reaction was leaden. Everywhere it was obstacles, everywhere it was impossibility. And when it came to this, a completely different reaction. And I'm still not convinced I fully understand. It seems to me to point not just to cognitive dissonance, but also to radical inconsistency. When Stern talks about market failure, that doesn't quite, sure, it's a market failure, but that's just the beginning of our problems.
Thank you for the reaction, Adam, too. So I think this comparison between COVID and climate is a very good starting point for the next 5 years, 5 years after the Paris Agreement, so that we really act and take the lessons of the COVID crisis. Hélène, you
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. So we are out of time, but really thank you for this discussion. There is a lot of food for thoughts. I would return to two main topics to achieve, what you have emphasized, to achieve the low carbon transition. So we need to answer the question how to pay for it independently of how it costs, and this is really important. You have put the public development banks at the heart of the system, and I'm really happy that we have held this conference in the kind of the Common in Finance Summit, and at the EFD we are really convinced that this sector is at the heart of what we can do looking forward. We are really engaged in building coalitions, and that was the purpose of this summit. And I understand that you encourage us to move forward. The second topic is to put justice at the heart of the reflection, because to achieve climate transition, we need to achieve a just climate transition. So the notion of justice is really important, and that questions also the question of the kind of development pathways, and you've put that on the emphasis, and we are very happy to be aligned at the AFD. We are working on that. I would have a really very last question for you all, and I regret Harold has left as well, but to come back to the domain of research, given all the discussion we've had, according to you all, what would be the main research priorities to achieve this all, and especially in a research department such as in AFD? So what would be the work program of Etienne and the team for the next few years? So I would be very interested in having your thought on that. So I don't know, maybe Adam can start, and Rogero and Eloi.
Your microphone is off.
In line with with that great slide that Harold put.
Okay.
It seems to me that that in the world that we're in, it may not be the world that we would choose to be in, but in the world that we're in, various types of public-private partnership of an imaginative variety with regards to the big transition challenges of countries like South Africa are the only game in town, and they are potentially a very interesting and important game. And when you looked at that slide about the ESCOM, winding down ESCOM, thinking through the logics of slicing and dicing, pooling, slicing, dicing, the risk and the return, and then figuring out the contractual frameworks that we need so as to ensure that it isn't simply taxpayers that end up absorbing all of the risks so that the benefits are privatized and the risks are socialized, which we know is the risk in those kind of arrangements, is a huge challenge, but I think indispensable. And just right there, we had a beautiful example. I mean, if you take ESCOM, do not go any further, just take ESCOM and see whether there's some way of making that a good example over the next 5 years. Because right now it's a nightmare for that country, for the people who live there. It doesn't provide power. It's a financial liability, and it's a carbon hazard. And if we can do ESCOM, then there's future. Then there's a positive future. But we need to do ESCOMs, lots of them. So I would think that focus everything on that. And there's such, as we know, as we saw, there's real mobilization in South Africa around the problem itself. There were local partners with extraordinary expertise to actually work with. So it will be a question really of standing back and listening and learning and generalizing from there. That would be my number one recommendation.
Thank you very much. I recall that Eloi has to leave at 30, so maybe Giugiaro, if you allow me to give the floor to Eloi before.
I will be very quick and without surprise. I think that you should really work on practical solutions for the just transition. I mean, if we could have, a conversation, starting at the AFD between parties, between stakeholders on what kind of criteria we should use to allocate this carbon budget, and then have conversation about the different kind of national policies and comparing situations, comparing countries, because there is no universal recipe for this, but how do you do fair carbon taxation? How do you do fair climate policy? And having different patterns, different profiles, I think would be hugely important and hugely beneficial to have just a set of just climate policies for the future. I'm really sorry I'm already late. Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much. Rogerio, nice to meet you in this floor.
I'm sorry, I thought you closed it. Let me be very brief. We tend to be biased towards the corner of research that we are doing. And let me go back to my Schumpeterian kind of instinct, okay? What I learned in the past few years, we're looking at technologies and looking at developments, is that climate change is a tragedy, just like a pandemic is a tragedy, but always an extraordinary moment for a Schumpeter kind of transformation through innovation. It's all out there. I mean, it's the systems that we have built in the past 100 years. They create dynamism by open frontiers of possibilities, and that's when the main actors, mainly the private sector, goes in and does that. And let me look at the Keynesian part of that, which is the state having a role in guiding and sending the signals of where these changes are going to take place. And finance is extremely important. All the changes that are in the past 200 years occurred or speeded up when finance can be geared or can be moved towards that specific process of change. Either that happens spontaneously, it takes a long time, or the government leads in the creation of new institutional states, create the institution setting. Just like the Bretton Woods meeting created a new international financial architecture that allow for so much growth and development and so on, you need a new kind of thinking of the institutional requirements to mobilize the resources, to bring finance into that process, and to make that resources not only available to the countries that already have that very well developed, but countries that are at the moment having to think whether they're going to lock into stranded assets backed on fossil fuels, or if they want to start building better, not just building back better, building better by using the technology available for transition. So I'll stop here. I mean, from my corner, this is what I see. What kind of institutional requirements you need to develop the cooperation within the public policy instruments, the international policy instruments, and the private sector in order to mobilize the resources for this transition. And if we can manage to do a little bit of that, I think that the frontiers are very, very wide for significant transformation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your consideration. So, and I will stop here. Last word, just to say that in South Africa, we are deeply involved in just transition academic research in South Africa, and we will continue further. And thank you all for your guidance. We will take it on board. I would like to thank again all the panelists, Adam, Rogerio, Eloi has left, and Harald. Thank you, Etienne, for organizing. And we'll be happy to have another conversation within 2 weeks, or maybe the 15th of next week, by the way, so time flies. And thank you again for your thoughts, and thank you to all the participants for being with us and for their questions. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.